Imagine moving into your dream home, only to be tormented by the worst neighbor imaginable. But what happens when you've had enough and decide to take matters into your own hands? Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. Moving into my new home was supposed to be a fresh start. I'd spent months searching for the perfect place, a quiet neighborhood where I could finally enjoy some peace and stability. The house was everything I'd hoped for, spacious with a big backyard and, most importantly, a long, private driveway leading up to my garage. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors were friendly, the streets were well kept, and I had no reason to think I'd run into any trouble. That was until I met her, Karen. It didn't take long for me to realize that Karen wasn't just any ordinary neighbor. She was the neighbor, the self-appointed ruler of the community, the type of person who weaponized the HOA to enforce rules that benefited her and made life difficult for everyone else. I had only been in my house for a few hours when she made her grand entrance, marching up my driveway with an air of entitlement that could rival royalty. "Excuse me," she called out, arms crossed, her tone sharp and authoritative. I didn't see a moving permit submitted to the HOA. I blinked. "A what?" She sighed dramatically, as if I were some clueless child. "All move-ins need to be approved. We have standards here. You can't just bring in a truck and start unloading." I glanced at my moving truck, then back at her. "I don't think I need HOA approval to move into my own house." Her lips thinned into a scowl. "Well, technically you do. But since you're already here, I guess I'll let it slide this time. Just make sure you follow the rules from now on." I should have known right then that she was going to be a problem. But I was exhausted from moving, and I had no energy to argue. I nodded, muttered a polite sure, and went back to unpacking. That was my first mistake. Over the next few days, I noticed small things that seemed off. The first red flag was Karen's car. Every morning, I would wake up and find it parked closer and closer to my driveway. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe she had a weird parking habit, or maybe she wasn't paying attention. I didn't want to be the new neighbor who immediately started complaining, so I let it slide. But then it got worse. One morning, I walked outside to find her car parked partially across my driveway. I could still squeeze my car out, but just barely. I decided to be diplomatic about it. I grabbed a sticky note, wrote a polite message. "Hey, just a heads up, your car is blocking part of my driveway. Could you be mindful when parking? Thanks," and left it on her windshield. The next day, her car was parked even worse. This time, she had angled it in such a way that I couldn't get my car out without maneuvering back and forth like I was escaping a parking garage in a video game. I knocked on her door. When she opened it, she had a smug look on her face, like she had been expecting me. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile. "I think your car is blocking my driveway." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I don't think so." I gestured toward the car. "Yeah, I can't really get out." She sighed dramatically, as if I were inconveniencing her. "Fine, I guess I'll move it." She guessed she'd move it? That should have been my second warning. But again, I let it go. That was my second mistake. The next morning, I was completely blocked in. Her car was parked sideways across my driveway, making it physically impossible for me to leave. I knocked on her door again, this time a little more forcefully. When she answered, she had a coffee cup in one hand and an innocent smile on her face. "Morning," she chirped. "Karen," I said, my patience wearing thin. "Your car is blocking my driveway." She took a slow sip of her coffee. "Oh, is it? Huh. I thought I left enough space." I stared at her. "I literally can't leave." She sighed, making a big show of setting down her coffee before stepping outside. "Well, I guess I can move it." This became a pattern. Every day, her car would be positioned more aggressively. I tried everything, talking to her, leaving notes, even calling the HOA. But guess what? Karen was the HOA. Every complaint I made disappeared into a black hole. The few neighbors who sympathized with me just shook their heads and said, "Yeah, that's just Karen." The final straw came when I had an emergency. I woke up one morning with severe stomach pain and needed to get to the doctor. But when I stepped outside, Karen's car was not only blocking my driveway, it was locked, and she was nowhere to be found. I knocked. No answer. I called her phone. Straight to voicemail. I had to call a rideshare just to get to the hospital, and by the time I got back, her car was still there, like a monument to her pettiness. That was it. I was done. I tried reasoning. I tried following the rules. But Karen didn't care about rules. She cared about control. And if I wanted to get my driveway back, I needed to do something drastic. That was when the idea struck me. If Karen wanted to park across my driveway so badly, I'd make sure she could never do it again. It was time for some home improvement. And by home improvement, I meant digging a giant trench around my driveway and installing a drawbridge. I started planning immediately. I researched local zoning laws to make sure I wasn't violating anything. As it turned out, there were no restrictions against digging on private property as long as I wasn't interfering with public infrastructure. That was all I needed to know. I called in a few favors, hired some help, and got to work. Over the next few days, my driveway transformed from a simple concrete path to something out of a medieval fortress. A deep trench surrounded it on all sides, making it completely inaccessible unless you really wanted to risk damaging your car. But the masterpiece? A fully functional wooden drawbridge that I could raise and lower at will. By the time Karen returned from her weekly yoga retreat, my project was complete, and the look on her face when she saw it? Priceless. Karen had turned my life into a nightmare, but I wasn't about to roll over and let her win. If she wanted to park across my driveway so badly, I'd make sure she could never do it again. That's when I had the idea, the most ridiculous, over-the-top, yet completely legal way to deal with her. I was going to dig a giant trench around my driveway and install a drawbridge. It started with research. I spent hours poring over zoning laws, HOA regulations, and property rights. As it turned out, there were no restrictions against modifying my own driveway, so long as I wasn't obstructing public roads or violating safety codes. That meant I was free to dig, build, and turn my property into a medieval fortress if I wanted to. Of course, this wasn't a job I could do alone. I needed professionals. I reached out to an old friend, Mark, who worked in construction. At first, he thought I was joking. "You want to build what around your driveway?" He laughed. "A trench, a deep one, and then a drawbridge," I said, completely serious. There was silence on the other end of the call. "Then, dude, that's either the most genius or the most insane thing I've ever heard." I love it. With Mark's help, I put together a small team to get the job done quickly and efficiently. The trick was to finish everything while Karen was away on one of her little weekend trips. I hired an excavation crew under the guise of landscaping improvements. We marked out the area, ensuring the trench would be wide enough to prevent any car from crossing, but still manageable enough for the drawbridge installation. The workers didn't ask too many questions, but I could tell they were curious. One of them, an older guy named Frank, finally asked, "You expecting a medieval siege or something?" "Nah," I smirked. "Just one really annoying neighbor." Frank chuckled. "Man, I've seen some crazy HOA feuds, but this takes the cake." With the digging underway, I turned my attention to the most critical part of the plan, the drawbridge. This wasn't some flimsy wooden plank. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it right. I consulted an engineer to design a heavy-duty wooden bridge with reinforced steel supports. The mechanism was simple yet effective. A pulley and counterweight system to raise and lower the bridge. Thick chains for stability. A hand crank winch, ensuring I could operate it easily. Weatherproofing to protect against rain and erosion. It was the kind of thing you'd expect to see in front of a castle, and I loved it. Once the trench was fully dug, we installed the wooden beams along the sides to prevent soil erosion and added the massive drawbridge at the entrance. It took a few days, but when it was done, it looked like something straight out of a medieval stronghold. And then we waited. The morning Karen returned from her trip, I made sure to be outside, casually drinking my coffee. Right on cue, her car came speeding down the road, aiming straight for my driveway. And then she slammed on the brakes. Karen's car skidded to a stop mere inches from the gaping trench in front of her. I watched as her face contorted with disbelief and rage. She threw her car into park, yanked open the door, and stormed toward me. "What the hell is this?" she screamed, gesturing wildly at the trench. "Oh, this." I took a sip of my coffee. "Just a little home improvement project." She stomped to the edge of the trench, staring down at it like it was a personal insult. "You can't just..." You can't do this. Actually, I can, I said, pulling out a printed copy of the local zoning laws. I made sure to check. No rules against digging on my own property. Her face turned a shade of red I didn't even know was possible. You did this just to spite me. I shrugged. You kept blocking my driveway. Figured this would solve the problem permanently. She let out an inhuman screech and turned to the handful of neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle. This is insane. You all see this, right? One of the neighbors, a guy named Tom, just laughed. Honestly, Karen, you had it coming. Karen's eyes widened in horror. You're all on his side? Another neighbor, Susan, chimed in. You've been terrorizing this neighborhood for years, Karen. Consider this karma. Karen looked completely betrayed. For the first time, I think she realized she wasn't as powerful as she thought. But she wasn't done yet. I knew Karen wasn't going to accept defeat gracefully. And sure enough, within the hour, she was on the phone with the HOA president. I watched from my porch as she waved her arms, pointing at the trench like it was a crime scene. Eventually, the HOA rep showed up, took one look at my construction, and sighed. Karen, he said, we've been over this. It's his property. He hasn't broken any rules. But he dug a moat. Technically, it's a trench, I corrected. Karen looked like she was about to explode. Fine, I'll call the police. I grinned. Go ahead. She actually did. She called the non-emergency police line and reported me for illegally obstructing access. When the officers arrived, they took one look at my setup and stifled laughter. Sir, did you build a drawbridge? Yep. The officer looked at Karen. Ma'am, this is private property. He has every right to modify it as he sees fit. Karen sputtered in disbelief. But it's ridiculous. The officer shrugged. Not illegal, though. Karen's final weapon, authority, had failed her. With nowhere to park, Karen had to start parking in her own driveway, something she clearly hated. She spent the next few weeks pouting, giving me death glares every time she saw me, but she never parked across my driveway again. The neighbors, meanwhile, loved it. People actually stopped by just to see my ridiculous yet effective revenge project. One even jokingly suggested I start charging an entry fee for crossing the bridge. Over time, Karen's power in the neighborhood waned. The HOA, tired of her constant complaints, eventually voted her out of her position. And me? I enjoyed every second of it. I had turned the biggest nuisance in my life into a permanent victory, all while staying perfectly within the rules. And the best part? I still have the coolest driveway in town. After Karen's attempts to fight back had utterly failed, I figured she'd finally learned her lesson. But of course, I had underestimated just how far she was willing to go to make my life miserable. If anything, she became even more determined to get revenge. I could see it in the way she glared at me every morning, the way she whispered to other neighbors when she thought I wasn't looking, and the way she stomped back in her house every time she saw my drawbridge go up and down. It was eating her alive, and I loved every second of it. For a while, things stayed quiet. She had lost her power in the HOA. People were openly laughing about the Trent situation, and I had successfully cut off her ability to block my driveway. I figured she'd eventually give up and move on. But no, Karen wasn't the type to move on. She was the type to escalate. One morning, I woke up to an official-looking notice taped to my door. My first thought was that the HOA was making another desperate attempt to rein me in, but when I read it, I realized it was much worse. It was a city notice claiming that my trench and drawbridge were a safety hazard and had to be removed within 30 days, or I'd face fines and possible legal action. I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly who was behind this. Karen must have been making phone calls, spinning stories, and convincing someone at the city office that my driveway was a public menace. I wasn't about to let that happen. The first thing I did was contact a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one who specialized in property disputes. I gathered all my paperwork, the zoning regulations I had reviewed before digging, the construction permits I had obtained, and every bit of evidence showing that my project was fully within the law. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Lisa, looked everything over and smirked. "Oh, this is going to be fun," she said. Together, we drafted a formal response challenging the city's claim. Lisa pointed out that my trench was entirely on private property, that it posed no actual risk to public safety, and that any complaints filed against it were likely motivated by personal grievances rather than legitimate concerns. She also noted that Karen's history of harassment and abuse of HOA power made it highly suspicious that this complaint had even been considered. I submitted the challenge and waited. A week later, a city inspector showed up. He was an older guy, the kind who had seen it all and wasn't easily impressed. He took one look at my trench and drawbridge, chuckled, and shook his head. "You know," he said, "in all my years, I've never seen anything like this. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" I asked. He shrugged. "Depends on who you ask." He spent the next hour going over every detail of my construction. He measured the depth of the trench, checked the structural integrity of the bridge, and even tested the pulley system. When he was done, he sighed and rubbed his chin. "I gotta be honest with you. There's nothing technically wrong with this. You did your homework, so I don't have to tear it down?" "Well," he said, hesitating, "that depends." "On what?" He gave me a knowing look. "On whether or not the city decides to push this just to make someone happy." And that was the problem. It didn't matter that I had done everything by the book. Karen had connections, and she was willing to use them. The next few weeks turned into a bureaucratic nightmare. The city kept sending letters, claiming new reasons why my trench was a problem. First, they said it was an attractive nuisance, meaning it could tempt kids or animals to fall in. When I installed warning signs and security cameras, they switched tactics and claimed it violated the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. That was funny, considering half the houses on my street had peeling paint and overgrown lawns. It was obvious what was happening. Karen was pulling strings, trying to use every possible excuse to get my project shut down. But I wasn't about to lose. Lisa and I fought back against every single claim. When they said it was a safety hazard, I provided proof that it was structurally sound. When they claimed it was ugly, I gathered signatures from neighbors who said they didn't mind. When they tried to argue that it lowered property values, I pointed out that my home's appraisal had actually gone up. Karen was losing ground fast, and she knew it. That's when she got desperate. One night, I woke up to the sound of loud banging outside. I looked out my window and saw movement near the trench. My security cameras picked up everything. Karen and two of her friends, wearing dark clothes, trying to sabotage the drawbridge. I grabbed my phone and called the police. When the officers arrived, Karen tried to play innocent. "Oh, I was just inspecting it, making sure it's really safe, you know." In the middle of the night, one officer asked, unimpressed. Karen stammered, but the damage was done. The police reviewed the footage and arrested her for trespassing and attempted vandalism. Her two friends took plea deals, but Karen, ever the stubborn fool, tried to fight it. She lost. With a criminal charge on her record and her reputation in shambles, Karen finally gave up. She sold her house and moved away, leaving the neighborhood in peace for the first time in years. The best part? The trench and drawbridge stayed. And every time I lowered that bridge, I smiled, knowing that I had won.